The sun was setting over the Montana plains when Sarah first saw the stranger walking up the dusty road toward her ranch, and she knew right away that something about him was different from the other drifters who sometimes passed through looking for work or a hot meal. He moved slowly and deliberately, and there was a heaviness to his steps that spoke of more than just physical exhaustion, and when he got close enough for her to see his face, she noticed the deep lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. Sarah was 58 years old and had been running the ranch alone since her husband Robert passed 3 years ago. And in that time she had learned to read people quickly because out here in the open country you had to know who you could trust and who you couldn't. But this man, and she could see now that he was probably in his early 60s with graying hair beneath his worn hat, and something about his bearing suggested he had once been proud and capable, and something had broken in him along the way. He stopped at the fence line and removed his hat, and held it in both hands, like a man approaching a church, and called out to ask if she might have any work available, and maybe a place to sleep for the night. Sarah studied him for a long moment, and something in her heart, and maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was the memory of how Robert used to help every soul who crossed their path, and told her to say yes, walked over to the fence and told him her name and asked his, and he said it was William. But most folks called him Bill. And he had been a ranch hand most of his life, but had fallen on hard times after his wife died and he lost his last position. There was no self-pity in his voice when he said it, and just a simple statement of facts, and Sarah appreciated that, because she had never been one for drama or complaints, and she told him he could stay in the small cabin out back, and there was plenty of work to do around the place. Bill nodded gratefully and asked what time she wanted him to start in the morning, and Sarah almost smiled at that, because it had been so long since anyone had asked her permission for anything, and told him sunrise would be fine. That first night Sarah lay in bed thinking about the stranger in her cabin and wondering if she had made a mistake, but something told her she hadn't, and there was a goodness in his eyes that reminded her of her own father, who had been a gentleman despite the hard life he lived. The next morning Bill was already up when Sarah came out of the house, and he had fixed the broken hinge on the barn door and was starting to mend a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. Sarah brought him coffee and biscuits, and they sat together on the porch steps as the sun climbed higher and painted the prairie grass golden. And for a while neither of them spoke, because some silences are more comfortable than words. Eventually Bill told her about his life, and not because he wanted sympathy, but because she asked, and he had been married to his wife Martha for 37 years, and they never had children, though they wanted them. And when she died of cancer 2 years ago, he found he didn't know how to be in the world anymore. He had stayed on at the ranch where they both worked, but his heart wasn't in it, and the owner could see that, and eventually let him go. And since then, he had been drifting from place to place and trying to find some reason to keep going. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him about Robert and how they had built this ranch together over 30 years, and how some mornings she still set out 2 coffee cups before remembering she only needed one. They understood each other then in the way that people who have loved deeply and lost completely always understand each other, and something shifted between them, and not romance, but recognition, and 2 souls who knew what it meant to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop. The days turned into weeks, and Bill proved to be as capable as Sarah had hoped, and he fixed everything that had been slowly falling apart since Robert died, and the loose boards and the squeaky gate and the irrigation system that never quite worked right. But more than that, he brought a presence to the place that had been missing, and the sound of someone else moving around, and the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone, and that if something happened there would be someone there who cared. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Bill told her about his daughter and a subject he hadn't mentioned before, and she lived in California with her family. And after Martha died, she had begged him to come live with them, but he couldn't do it. Sarah asked why not, and Bill was quiet for a long time before saying that he felt like he would be a burden, and that his sadness would darken their lives, and that it was better for everyone if he stayed away. Sarah turned to look at him then, and in the dim light from the house she could see the pain in his face. And she told him something she had learned in her own grief, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people love us even when we don't feel worthy of it. Bill didn't say anything, but she saw his hand tremble slightly as he raised his coffee cup, and she knew her words had reached something deep inside him. The next day, Sarah suggested they drive into town for supplies, and on the way back they passed the small white church where she and Robert had been married, and on impulse she asked Bill if he wanted to stop. They sat in the empty sanctuary and the afternoon light streaming through the simple windows and creating patterns on the wooden floor. And Sarah told him that after Robert died, she had been so angry at God that she stopped coming to church. But one day the pastor had come to visit, and he didn't offer platitudes or try to explain why bad things happen, and he just sat with her in silence, and eventually he said that God was big enough to handle her anger, and that sometimes faith meant showing up even when you didn't believe anymore. Bill nodded slowly and said he wished he had heard that after Martha died, and maybe things would have been different, and Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand and told him it wasn't too late. That Sunday they went to church together, and Sarah in her best dress and Bill in a clean shirt she had washed and pressed for him. And when the congregation sang the old hymns, Sarah heard Bill's voice beside her, and rough but sincere and trying. After the service, several people came up to welcome them, and including Margaret Wilson, who had been Sarah's friend since childhood, and she invited them both to Sunday dinner the following week, and Sarah accepted before she could overthink it. That dinner became a regular thing, and then other invitations followed, and a community potluck, and a birthday celebration for one of the neighbors, and a barn raising for a young family who had just moved to the area. Bill was slowly becoming part of the fabric of their small community, and people liked his quiet competence and the way he always offered to help without being asked, and the gentle way he spoke to children and animals. One afternoon, Bill was teaching a neighbor's grandson how to rope and showing him the proper grip and the way to swing the lasso in a smooth circle, and Sarah watched from the porch and remembered how Robert had always said that the measure of a man was in how he treated those who could do nothing for him. The boy was struggling and getting frustrated, and Bill just kept encouraging him with patience and telling him about all the times he had missed when he was learning and making it okay to fail. When the boy finally got it right and the loop settling neatly over the fence post, and his face lit up with joy, and Bill's face did too. And Sarah realized she couldn't remember the last time she had seen Bill smile like that. That evening she told him he should call his daughter, and Bill looked surprised and a little frightened, and Sarah reminded him of what she had said about letting people love us, and Bill nodded but said he didn't know what to say. Sarah suggested he didn't need to say much, and just that he was thinking about her and wanted to hear her voice. And Bill took a deep breath and picked up the phone. Sarah went outside to give him privacy, but she could hear the murmur of his voice through the window, and at first halting and uncertain, and then growing stronger. And when she came back an hour later, his eyes were red, but he was smiling. His daughter had cried when she heard his voice and told him she missed him so much, and that her children asked about Grandpa Bill all the time, and she understood why he needed to be on his own for a while, but she hoped someday he would come visit. Bill told Sarah that he had promised to go see them at Christmas and that he was terrified and happy, and Sarah laughed and said that was usually how the best things in life felt, as autumn deepened into winter. Bill and Sarah fell into an easy routine, and working together during the day and sharing meals in the evening, and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence and sometimes talking about everything and nothing. Bill told her about his childhood in Wyoming and growing up on a ranch much like this one, and learning to ride before he could properly walk, and his father's rough affection, and his mother's gentle songs. Sarah shared her own memories and playing in the creek that ran through her family's property, and the first time she met Robert at a county fair, and how he had won her a stuffed bear by throwing baseballs at milk bottles, and how she still had that bear tucked away in a closet. They talked about the things they missed and the small intimacies of marriage and having someone who knew how you took your coffee, and who noticed when you were sad, even when you tried to hide it, and who made everything less lonely just by being there. And they talked about the